morning, everybody. Welcome back to the UKDEA podcast studio. This morning I'm delighted to have with me Steve Hunt from Ener-Vate. So Steve, good morning, and do you mind just introducing yourself to the audience?
Hi Simon, and thanks for the invite. Yeah, my name's Steve Hunt. I am a director of Ener-Vate Consultancy, who carry out sort of commercial consultancy for the UK district heating market.
Great, thanks Steve. Do you mind giving us a bit of background of your interaction with the heat network industry through the years, how long you've been involved with it, sort of the kind of key projects that you've been involved with to date?
Yeah, I'd like to. I first got involved in 2006-07 at E.ON, if I can mention their name. So I was part of the E.ON team between 2007, 2013-14. And we introduced ourselves into the district heating market, primarily into London and the activity that was going on there. And we were relatively successful. We did quite a few schemes and interacted with lots of house builders and got to understand what the opportunities were and also the risks and so on. And then following the London successes, we got more involved into larger city centre schemes, and primarily from my point of view in Sheffield, through from Sheffield city centre, taking heat from the biomass station next to the M1 there in Sheffield. So the Don Valley system and connecting large off-takers there, such as the ice arena, the main entertainment arena there. I think there's the English Institute of Sport that's connected, so large off-takers across the whole of the Don Valley there. And so that was my introduction to district heating and primarily customers and what they were looking for and how they were interacting with networks and companies such as E.ON. So that's the sort of genesis of where Ener-Vate came from, really.
Okay. So moving on to your days with Ener-Vate, how long have you been involved with them, and what sort of projects have you been working on?
Well, we founded Ener-Vate, myself, Steve Marsh, my fellow directors, and also Joe Longdon. We founded Ener-Vate in 2013-14, began operation sort of 2014. And our view then, Simon, was that there was a lot of people that we were interacting with, such as the people in Sheffield that I've just mentioned there, and others that Joe and Steve were working on with E.ON. And our observation was that they didn't actually understand what we were saying to them. They didn't understand the questions that they needed to ask or the information that they needed. And it was very difficult to sort of sell the concept because there wasn't an educated client to sell it to or have that discussion with. And we sort of formed the idea, well, nobody's actually out there advising customers of their role, of their needs, of their opportunities, really. And so we had this germ of a thought to say, well, we should be on the other side of this table, having a discussion with customers and having a discussion with potential owners and operators of these schemes, and then interacting in the opposite way to people like E.ON and SSE and whoever else was about in those times, Kofi and so on.
So essentially sitting client side more, you'd say,
Yeah.
rather than a project delivery role.
Yeah, exactly right, and aiming to improve their understanding of what was on offer and what could be on offer.
Okay, cool. So it's most probably, 10 years of Ener-Vate? More than 10 years now.
Yeah, 10 years. We sort of celebrated our 10-year last year. We had a nice party, and that was great. There were 3 of us back in those days, as I said, the 3 founding directors. There are 20 or more of us now, so it's been relatively successful in those times. But
Great.
It's what I'd like to think anyway, the Ener-Vate DNA goes through commercial and also customer understanding and making sure that our industry is closer to and communicating with customers. That's my primary goal, really.
Okay. So very customer-centric, very customer-focused is how you see Ener-Vate moving forward.
It's always been Ener-Vate, and I hopefully anyway, I might not come across sometimes, but I'm quite an amenable chap. I like to think that I can talk to anybody at any level, and I think that's important. We can't get as an industry, when we talk to customers, too technical or too legal or too commercial. We have to have a conversation and make and allow them to feed into that conversation with their thoughts and so on, and take that away. I think we'll perhaps touch on later in this podcast, but I think we're very good at talking to ourselves as an industry, but how are we talking to customers? How should we talk to customers?
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Steve. I think we're very good at focusing on ourselves and sort of being highly technical and highly legal and highly commercial, but most probably not bringing with us those all-important customers. So what in this particular podcast this morning, I think one of the things that we're keen to talk about with you is what you see one of the key areas we should be working on in the sector moving forward. What do you think that key area should be then, Steve?
Well, in headline form, it's exactly as I said there. I think the government have a role to play here in that they have been supportive of heat networks in the past and continue to be supportive through grants and legislation that we all know is on its way and coming through the system. But my sort of worry is we are creating an industry that is almost to be connected to customers under obligation, or what's the demand out there? How can we create not only the finance and the structures to create the industry to go out and serve customers, but how do we create the demand from customers? And how do we therefore instigate that communication? Does that need to come from individual companies? Does that need to come from a central point? Is there more positivity that needs to be outlined generally from government? If they are putting all this millions of pounds worth of funding into district heat networks, where's the sort of soft landing for that? And in terms of demand, where are customers banging on our door wanting to connect to heat networks? And so I wouldn't aim to think that I've got all the answers to those questions today, but I think as an industry we need to start talking about them and understand where that communication needs to come from and what that communication needs to be.
Yeah, indeed. So essentially it's driving customers' demand, a desire to connect onto heat networks rather than, as you say, more of an obligation, which is very much how zoning is being portrayed and would be put onto customers. So in terms of the different actors in the sector, do you think there's specific actors that could have roles in this moving forward in terms of changing their approach to the sector? I mean, how successful do you think DESNZ have been to date in creating that demand from customers? Do you think that's not really been their focus to date? Do you think they need to engage with other parties? What's your thoughts on those issues, Steve?
From my understanding and from my knowledge in the industry, I don't think we I'm not talking about DESNZ in particular here, but I don't think we as an industry have been too successful just now. Joking apart, the only time you see a heat network on the TV is on Watchdog. You know, it ignores the 99% of heat networks that are trundling along very nicely. Thanks very much. But that's any product, I assume. But it's got to be a combination of all those things that you talk about there. The government have ploughed millions and continue to plough millions of pounds worth of grant into heat networks. But where is that communication from government to say heat networks are a great thing? You know, why are they not more active in that area? And how do we communicate with, let's say, a housing developer, just for instance? There's a housing developer. Why isn't the housing developer looking around for a heat network to connect to? Why has it got to be the other way around? Why have we got to approach the housing developer? It's that communication, that awareness, I think, of heat networks and their benefits. Now, whenever you describe a heat network to somebody in conversation, you must have done this for years, Simon, they always think, how interesting, how great that is, that the efficiencies and so on. It's always perceived as a positive thing when you have individual conversations, but it's never perceived as a positive thing when you're trying to impose or be part of that conversation with developers or off-takers. And I think where I'm going with this is, you say who needs to communicate. When, hopefully, Simon, when and if zoning becomes legislation and people are more aware of that legislation, then it would be a very difficult thing, I think, to the zone operator in any given zone to go and knock on 1,000 doors. There needs to be a centralised communication to say, this is in your area, this is what it means. That is the way that communication gets done at a grand level, to create the interest, to create the debate, to create the questions that then need to be answered by the zone provider. It is that communication and that awareness of what heat networks are and can be, for me, is the missing piece of our industry jigsaw.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Steve. I mean, from our consultation response to the heat network zoning consultation that DESNZ issued late in 2023, one of the key areas we put back was the need to raise the profile of heat networks nationally, create that awareness, because as you quite rightly say, knocking on 1,000 doors in a heat network zone is challenging. You don't want to have the same conversation over and over again. you need a good level of awareness of heat networks by the time you knock on people's doors, and also, the first steps, a kernel of a desire to want to connect rather than that resistance, or maybe building on negativity that they've seen on, as you say, on Watchdog or some other negative headline about the heat network. So I think maybe we're focusing on one of the initial key actors being the government through their heat network zoning programme really needs to run a national campaign to raise awareness, promote heat networks, and to talk about the benefits. Is that what I'm sensing from you?
It is. You're very much sensing the right thing there, Simon. One of the things that I always sort of try and do when I'm trying to explain this to anybody is communication isn't just delivering a message and then that's it. It's constant, and it's a drip all the time. Then the heat networks become part of the national conversation. They're something that people are aware of and can understand intrinsically what they are, and that can't be done in a 5-minute conversation. That needs to be done in 1,000 5-minute conversations, drip, and it's the perception will therefore alter. And I give the example of let's turn it completely on its head, just just allow me to play my favourite record a minute. I say this all the time, but imagine if heat networks were the go-to provision of heat for the last 50 years. Imagine everywhere was fed by a heat network for the last 50 years, 60 years. And then you and I go along and say, actually, here's a gas boiler, would you like to buy one? It doesn't mean one is intrinsically better than the other. It just means that everybody's used to one thing. And then when somebody turns around and tries to sell them something slightly different or unusual, or something that they're not aware of or they don't understand, it's a problem because it's different and it's unusual. So it's not the actual product that we're selling so much. It's the perception of what it is because it's different. If I went to a customer and said, well, here's a gas boiler, it's going to look exactly the same as your HIU on the wall. Your controls will be exactly the same. I'm going to bring gas into your house and then set fire to it, essentially. And then people would say, well, actually, couldn't that blow up? Couldn't my...
Well, a fair point,
and you could
Steve.
say, well, yeah, it could, but it won't because you've got all these safety measures in place, etc., etc. But it's then the sell is difficult or different because there is a perceived danger, there's a perceived problem, it's different to what they're used to. And I think what we've got to try and change is that this isn't better, worse, it's just we need as a UK, as the country, as the earth, to change the way that we provide heat. This is a great way of doing it, and let's get more people used to it and aware of it, and the perceptions of it will change naturally to allow a softer landing for when those networks are in place and those networks are operating fabulously and there's people wanting to connect to them. That's the point I'm trying to get to change people's perceptions of how we need to communicate.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, Steve. Imagining a world where gas boilers didn't exist in properties and trying to sell them back into a heat network sector where heat networks are commonplace throughout the country. I mean, the Danes are well known for looking at us rather oddly because we're sort of wedded to individual burners in each of our homes, and bringing heat in from the street is much more the norm in Denmark and certainly not the norm in the UK.
Yeah, and it's perception, isn't it? It's just people are not aware of it or are so used to their gas and the price of gas, of course, which is probably not part of this conversation, but perception is everything, and we need to change perception.
Yeah, no, completely agree. Thinking of the other actors in the sector, as well as DESNZ, you've got not just central government, but you've also got local government as well. What's your experience with local government and their reception for heat networks? How are you finding that? Is that sort of fairly varied across the country? You seeing a good knowledge base within local authorities? Is there a problem there in terms of educating local authorities? And can I ask you for your thoughts about how that interacts with heat network zoning and local authorities being zone coordinators as proposed, and whether they have the knowledge, expertise and capability to take on that role?
I think there was 10 questions there, Simon, but I think it's
there most probably is, Steve, but keen to get your thoughts on those.
I think, as you're probably already aware, and people listening to this podcast will be aware, there are varied results in that. There's some councils and some public authorities that are quite switched on and aware, but I would suggest that probably the majority are not. And why would they be? Why should they be? There is perhaps a general, there'll be exceptions to this, but there is a general lack of understanding of how to, first of all, develop, and then more importantly to then install and operate and maintain a heat network successfully from a public point of view. One of the questions we say at Ener-Vate, and when I say to when I meet councils, is that they have this. Well, let's put a heat network in. You think, well, first of all, why? Why do you want to put a heat network? What problem are you trying to solve? You know, because it very, very quickly goes down a technical route, Simon.
Yes.
We then start talking about, well, how big does the pipe need to be, and how large are the boilers / air source heat pumps, or whatever method of generation that you're talking about, and it becomes expensive quickly in terms of design. And it makes a lot of assumptions in terms of customers. And for me, that is almost backwards. We need to understand, first of all, why those public authorities and councils want to think about having a heat network in the first place. What problem are they trying to solve? And then secondly, the commercial side of that, well, perhaps I would say that, wouldn't I? But the commercial aspect of that needs to be absolutely in parallel with the technical, rather than the technical taking the lead initially and then almost the commercial following the technical. And I think a lot of people, or a lot of employees within government and local authorities, they wouldn't have that commercial understanding really. Perhaps they know of a select few design engineers and good design engineers in the industry, so they lean on that advice, but that advice becomes very technical very quickly. So again, what are they doing? What are they saying? And who are they saying it to? And why do they want to create a heat network in the first place would be my question. And then get to the crux of how that needs then to be developed from the ground up, both technically and also importantly commercially. And absolutely 100% part of that conversation should be to bring customers along and make sure that demand is there, that customer focus, that customer understanding of that when the development is complete, they are then not having to sell it to customers. The customers will already be there. So what role do they need to play? They need to play an active role and a more active role in the future, of course, with zoning. But they need to understand those three aspects. It's technical, it is commercial, and it is also customer focused. And I think that customer side of things, again, saying the same thing, stuck record, but that customer side of things is the thing that's lacking.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point, Steve, that, you know, too often my view is there's a bit of a gravy train, want for the better word, maybe a sausage machine that churns out techno-economic studies that look at the technical solution for how to create a heat network. But as you say, very rarely, if ever, do those studies really focus down into what the customers want, who the customers are, and making sure that the customers are on board with the plan that's being created. Those are really interesting points, Steve. Thanks very much. What's your thought in terms of where there have been pockets of success within local authorities creating a heat network? What do you think have been the key drivers why we've seen successes in some places? Is it things like champions within local authorities? Is it particular energy sources that were available for use in those heat networks? What do you think have been the critical success factors in delivering heat networks where they have been brought forward successfully?
I think that's a good use of the word champion, Simon. I think there are individual champions that perhaps we all know from the past and involved in particular networks. I don't profess to know all the networks all over the UK. I certainly don't know all of them. But some of the older ones that I've been involved with down in the southwest, for instance, and down in Exeter, there were definitely champions within Exeter Council and East Devon Council back in the day, then when I was working at E.ON, that were really sort of forceful in their taking views and taking the structure of what needed to be done from a public point of view forward. And without those individuals, really, then it perhaps would have failed. So I think champions within councils are absolutely important and imperative. So I can't. I'm trying to think of the chap's name down in Exeter now, but I can't quite remember. But I do think you need support within the council, because not only councils, but even housing authorities or housing associations. They are such a wide-ranging structure that where do heat networks sit within each of those structures? They tend to be spread out between about 5 different structures, or 5 different areas within the structure, I should say, and therefore never quite land with a responsibility, and therefore never have that drive and energy unless some individual takes that sort of mantle. So I think where they have been successful, in my experience, they've always had a champion.
Okay. No, that's really interesting. So I think there's sort of 2 key takeaways so far in our chat. One is that we need to create more support, more desire from customers, and we also need to sort of nurture and support champions within local authorities to help bring heat networks forward.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts in terms of what the sector could be doing to help create those fans, those people who want to see heat networks? Do you think there's enough good news about heat networks that we're seeing out there in the press, or what can we do more to spread that good news? Steve, have you got any thoughts on that one?
Well, I certainly don't think there's enough good news. That's definitely for certain. As I said before, it's only complaints that you tend to see, or problems that you tend to see. So good news stories would really help. I always think the one show, it'd be it's a great sort of dumping ground, really, the one show for this sort of thing, that type of communication, to have, regular 6-month heat network positivity on something like that, or some major program on the TV anyway, without the usual watchdog type focus. And sorry, what was the initial question there, Simon?
So essentially, is it what would we as the sector be doing, do you think, in terms of the developers of heat networks? Do you think it's possible maybe rerunning much more of a promotional campaign to promote heat networks, how they're seen, what the benefits are of heat networks, to sort of raise the profile, to support what we would like DESNZ to do as part of the heat network zoning?
Yeah, I do, but I'd go back to my point about what problem are we trying to solve, So it's not, here's a heat network and it's different to your gas boiler. You've got to explain, first of all, why are we not supporting gas anymore? What is it that we're trying to achieve? Take people back to the original argument, to say that, it goes back to the whole climate change and the way that the UK is looking to supply its heat. How much of the carbon output is supplied by heat? How much can we therefore contribute to climate change by reducing that carbon factor within heat? What part do people play within that to enable them to seek positive answers to that? Well, yeah, I like my gas boiler. It's nice and regular. It's cheap. I understand it. But I understand that I need to do something different. I want to be part of this climate change train that we're all on. So explaining all that in the first place. And obviously, heat networks are not the answer to every single problem, Simon. You and I know that. It's just impossible to say that heat networks are the answer for every situation. They are not, quite clearly. But where they really do fit the bill, where they are going to meet the needs of the difficult to decarbonise areas of the country, that's the sort of communication. Where do heat networks fit? Why should they fit in this place? Why are they the best answer to this particular problem in this area? And it's getting back to the argument, why are we doing what we're doing, explaining what the benefit heat network can be, and making sure that we concentrate on the right areas, and rather than chase every single opportunity everywhere where clearly heat pumps or something else might be the best in those cases. Let's make sure that we put heat networks and communicate heat networks where they need to be.
No, absolutely. No, indeed. What are your thoughts in terms of the more national organisations? Should we be reaching out on a national basis? I think one of the problems we have as a sector is there's lots of players and, talking to sort of hotel or leisure centre chains, talking individually or talking maybe individually to developers. Do you think there needs to be much more of maybe a national forum to engage with those organisations who act up and down the country, so that when we as heat network developers, or where the heat network developer sector is talking to those organisations, there's sort of a national attitude to how they should be engaging with heat networks, rather than a new conversation every time?
That would be a great idea, actually, Simon. Yeah, and sort of occurred to me on that particular front. But yeah, it would. We need to have 100 conversations, not 1,000 or 10,000, and grouping people together in that way would be useful. And in that conversation needs to be all the aspects that we talked about before. It needs to be a commercial conversation. Clearly, it's not going to work without the commerciality being correct. We need to have good technical innovation and solutions, but we also need to understand customers and their needs. So we're not just talking to customers, we're listening as well. My old sales mentor, we got 2 ears and 1 mouth. That's what, and they should be used in that proportion.
We must have had the same mentor, because somebody told me that as well, Steve. That's a good point. Yes,
exactly. So let's go out there, and whilst we are talking, but also let's double our listening and say, well, what are the barriers? What is the issue that we need to address, etc. as an industry? So it needs to be a wide conversation.
No, brilliant. No, I think that's really good. So it's working to try and reduce the number of conversations, engage at more of a multiple level than lots of little granular levels. That's a really important one. So far we've talked about creating more fans, more demand from heat networks. We've talked about champions. What do you think about the role of local authorities for sort of zone coordinators? How could they act to create a positive environment for the delivery of heat networks within their area? What do you think about that, Steve?
My worry, I don't know if you share this, Simon, is that whoever is appointed the zone coordinator isn't aware enough of the conversation that we're having now. What's the experience of that coordinator? Who would want to be that from industry or existing industry colleagues, or are those people going to be public sector personnel that need to learn as they go along? I think my worry is the experience of who that coordinator could and should be. We talked about champions just now. They need to really understand the benefits and also the risks of heat networks and be aware enough to not be led by any one particular group. They have to be a fairly astute and business-like, but also communicative person. And I'm just wondering how many of those are available to us as an industry. That's my concern.
Yeah. So almost the zone coordinator needs to be the sort of the local advocate for heat networks, supporting and creating a facilitating environment for the heat network developer to operate in, rather than just somebody who sits back in their ivory tower, monitoring the development of the heat network developer. Would that be correct to say, Steve?
Yeah, and aware of again, I keep coming back to the same things, but aware of what we're trying to do, not what we are trying to do as an industry, but what we are trying to do as the UK PLC. What is it that council in particular is trying to achieve? What targets does it need to meet, and how, therefore, do heat networks or the zone of a heat network fit into that? And then you can direct your conversations. Once you understand that solid ground that you're talking about, you can direct your conversations and make your decisions accordingly, and not just take the decision that's beneficial that week because somebody said something to you that week. It's got to be absolutely consistent with what we're trying to achieve, both as an industry, both as a council as well, and as a UK. Okay,
and in terms of part of creating that desire for customers to connect onto heat networks, one of the things that I think we're particularly concerned about as an association is the fact that the UK government at the moment seems to have lost its way a little bit in terms of decarbonisation of heat. It's very much focused on electricity with the new government, with GB Energy. It's published a new powering up decarbonising Britain through electricity 2030 plan. Do you think there's enough understanding out there in the UK public and UK businesses of the need to decarbonise heat? Do you think that's at the top of their agenda at the moment, Steve?
It's a good question. Probably not is the answer, for the reasons we've already stated. Everybody talks about electricity, and obviously heat pumps will play a huge role in the future, of course, as they will within the heat networks as well. But we can't all suddenly turn on heat pumps as a nation. So there is a lack of awareness of what else can be done. What is the alternative to all that electricity, and how can that electricity be best utilised, not just from an individual, but as a community? How can we best utilise this electricity as a community, as an area, yes, and where heat networks play their part in that?
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. Moving on into other thoughts of low carbon heat. So, Steve, what's your thought about the the general position of heat and the need to decarbonise it in the UK at the moment. My concern is that I completely agree with you that it's important to create more desire, a greater number of fans, people who want to connect onto heat networks. But do you think there's a really good understanding from the UK populace and businesses about their need to decarbonise heat, to drive decarbonisation of energy in the UK?
I don't think there is, Simon. To answer very bluntly, there is a lot of focus on electricity, as we've said. I think this government is focused on electricity to a certain degree in their public announcements anyway. And things like the RHI that were prevalent 10 years ago, wherever it was, when 5 years ago, that was sort of encouraging heat to a certain degree, which I don't think has been replaced directly. So understanding from government, again, going back to my point, what are we trying to do as a nation? What are we aiming to do? And maybe it's just time and resource from a government. You know, they don't have ultimate resources. They have to concentrate on one thing or the other. But I know there is a vast amount of carbon emitted through heat in the UK, and that's not all going to be solved by electricity or individual electricity, I should say. So it is understanding how best, therefore, the electricity that we have, the investment in the electricity grid that's required, how can we best utilise the resource that we have, and that comes alongside electric vehicle charging. That's going to, hopefully revolutionise the car emissions and so on. So how do we utilise that electricity? How do we encourage the use and storage of electricity for heat? For instance, how do we create that balanced decarbonisation across all sectors? Because electricity is going to have an important part to play, whether it's individual or heat networks. I think electricity is going to be utilised in the future. But I don't think there's enough awareness of alternate sources. There's a lot of heat out there already. It's in the sewers, it's in the energy from waste plants. It's everywhere. Heat is around us everywhere. So how can we utilise that heat without needing to generate more heat, essentially? And how do you generate more heat generally nowadays in the future? That's through electricity. And if that electricity can be utilised elsewhere to charge cars or do something else, or be stored overnight or during the day and be used overnight, that combination of thought, that concentration on heat as a conversation piece, I think has sadly been lost over the last 4 or 5 years or so.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree, Stephen. Certainly, as the government are telling us through all their statistics that the largest carbon emitter in the UK today is the heat sector. It's about bringing the focus back in onto heat. I think it's also interesting for listeners to touch on the changing face of heat networks over the last 5 to 10 years, particularly post-gas-fired CHP. And I think one of the educational points and raising awareness with customers is the very diverse source of heat sources that can be brought into heat networks today. And you talked on sewer source heat there. Could you just tell us a bit more about your thinking on the sort of various different sources of heat that can be used in heat networks today?
Well, sewers is definitely one that really interests. I mean, sewers are literally everywhere. They're a network already. In every town centre, in every city centre, there are huge sewer opportunities to take the heat and create a more efficient heat network via electricity pumps, etc., from sewers. And they're expensive, of course, Simon. Who's going to invest in that, and therefore who's going to invest in that without zoning legislation, first of all, but also without that solid base of demand and understanding of customers wanting to be part. Yes. So sewers will certainly play a part. And I'm wondering whether there can be incentives, there can be government incentives or rewards to be utilising heat where it is available rather than just going on to generating new heat. So when we have when we have utilised all the available heat to us, then we'll generate more heat. But let's try and utilise that heat. So sewers is one, of course. Energy from waste plants. We know that energy from waste, energy from waste, we know that recycling plants have tended to be in the middle of nowhere for very good reason in the past. So planning conditions around energy from waste and how to utilise the heat from or where they should be utilised in the future should be part of planning. Data centres. Now, we've not mentioned data centres, Simon, but I think data centres will play a huge role. There's going to be absolute massive requirement for more data.
Yep.
AI is coming. I'm sure there's AI on this podcast somewhere. I'm not sure of it. But I talk to data center providers regularly nowadays, and when you see their curve on terms of the data that's going to be required over the next 10, 15, 20 years, there is going to be huge heat emissions. And therefore, we have got to tap in. The two industries need to be absolutely dovetailed on how we can retrieve their heat, because it's a great cost benefit to the data center. There is a benefit to the data center of using that heat. So how can we almost be a single industry, really? Where can we put the data to best use the heat, and how can we utilize that? Because that is almost, it's golden as far as I'm concerned, the data center option. And then obviously industry, where can we utilize industry heat? Heavy industry, where can we get? So there's got to be more government incentive. There's got to be more understanding of, don't just create new heat. Where can we get the heat from, and how can we dovetail the two?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. That, as you quite rightly say, sort of summarising your points, that what we need to do is focus on where heat is already existing, utilising that heat in heat networks, and reverting back to using primary fuel electricity to generate new heat sources. And I think one of my big concerns is that is a strong benefit that heat networks can deliver nationally. But again, that is not very well understood. I don't think people really understand the potential energy sources for heat networks. And I think that's another thing that we can do in terms of raising the profile of heat networks across the UK. We can use those waste heat sources to heat homes, as opposed to using either primary fossil fuel gas or even in a decarbonised world, electricity.
And you know what, Simon? If you sat in a room with 100 people and described a heat network that was going to be developed utilising data centres, emissions, I should say, of heat, everybody would smile at that and say, well, that's clever, isn't it? That's a good use of resource. I don't think anybody could disagree with that. And getting the public to understand that, and getting the public to be on board with that, and how to store that heat, for instance. I think storage of heat, Simon, will become very much... I know we got thermal storage now, but the phase change materials and the better efficiency method of storing heat, ideally from data centres, etc. People tend to smile at me and say, well, that's a wonderful idea, that's great. And if you then communicate that in a way that there is a community and there's 100 people nodding and smiling,
yes,
then you've got a heat network, rather than just having that conversation with Jim on a Monday, or maybe on a Sunday. But Jim on a Monday and John on a Tuesday, and there's no link up between the two. But if you can get that communicative, positive message across, then I think we can then design the solutions technically to really create something good.
Good. Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm circling back to one of your key themes of this particular chat, which is about creating greater awareness of heat networks, creating a customer demand. What's your current thinking about the sort of the educational system and the sort of not highly technical training, but more awareness in schools and colleges of heat networks? Have you seen anything on that at all? Do you agree that's an area that's sadly lacking? And if we're going to deliver 20% of heat from heat networks in the UK by 2050, do we need to be doing more in sort of a primary, secondary, and further education to raise awareness of heat networks?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great point, and let's face it, we'll all be very long in the tooth by 2050. Hopefully, I'll still be here looking at the success of the industry, but the people who are going to live with these networks are the future generations, and therefore, the more familiar they are, and the less familiar they are with gas, essentially, that transition, the better. To say gas is outdated, it's dirty, it contributes to climate change. These are the things that we've got to move towards, and education on that would be key, and then that would also stimulate interest to become part of the industry, which we need more personnel, etc. So I think that's a great point, and probably one of the starting points of communication. Yeah,
indeed. Yeah, getting in while they're early, getting them while they're young.
Yeah,
and making them want to desire and deliver heat networks. Yeah, no, absolutely.
It is, and just to sort of extenuate that point, sometimes when, back in the day, going back to the Sheffield days, sort of 10, 15 years ago, I remember one particular customer, and the problem was that old Jim, who looked after the gas boilers for the last 40 years, might be out of work. And that was the problem. And therefore, when you create something that doesn't mean that Jim is out of work, he's just working in a different way,
Yes.
then that helped to get that connection over the line in the end. And that's why I say about listening sometimes. You can put the best thing in the world together, commercially, technically, but if there's some illogical reason that the customer doesn't either tune into it or understand it, or there's a barrier there, we need to listen to what that barrier is and overcome it and design something to get around it.
Yeah, no, indeed. So you've spoken in this chat and more recently about barriers and customer barriers and overcoming those and creating a desire from customers to connect. Apart from the sort of the general lack of awareness of heat networks when you're commencing that conversation with a customer, what do you see as the sort of the typical barriers that customers put up, or the typical reasons that customers tell you why they don't want to connect to heat networks that we could resolve? Or do you think there are things that we can resolve but as part of the sales process, but they're simply not aware of these issues? Customers are simply not aware of the benefits of heat networks.
I'll go back to that word familiarity. What are you? Is it revolutionary to them? Well, it's very familiar to you and I, and probably the people listening to this podcast. But it's revolutionary to some customers. Therefore, it's risky. It's frightening. It's a little bit scary. So first of all, that familiarity needs to be overcome, and so on. And then let's get down to it, Simon. There's got to be price and service levels and certainty of those things. Now, from an electricity and a gas network point of view, there is a lot of familiarity who the players are. There's a lot of familiarity of the service levels that they should be receiving. Ofgem obviously has been there for years and years. So a lot of those concerns should in the future be reduced, because Ofgem are now appointed as regulator from next year onwards, as we all know. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it comes to then service levels from the individual company proposing, and also cost and price, and making sure that they understand what that price is.
Yes.
Not only on the product that they are buying, but the realistic alternative.
Yes, the counterfactual.
Getting back to the point, what are we all trying to do here? And at some point, Mr. Customer, you will have to do something. It's just as plain as the nose on your face. We cannot continue the way that we're continuing just now. So making sure that there is a full understanding and awareness of what those costs are. It's not just 4 pence for gas and 6 pence for district heating. That's not the comparator. It is what is required to heat your property over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Yep.
And making sure that you understand fully that these are the costs that you will face, and these are the costs that the heat network can produce, and then aligning those costs. Sometimes it's capital is a problem. Well, can we do something different with the capital? Sometimes there's plenty of capital available. It's the operational costs. So how can you mould and create something that suits that particular customer, making sure that he understands the alternative.
No, that's really good. Thanks very much for those points, Steve. Okay, well, this has been a really interesting chat, Steve. Thanks very much indeed for coming into the UKDEA podcast studio. If I can just sum up for those listening, I think what Steve wants to do is he wants to create more fans, he wants to create more desire for heat networks from customers. To do that, we need to raise a national awareness, a national campaign, so we can get an understanding of what heat networks are generally amongst not only the general public but businesses. Also engage with businesses at a more strategic level rather than having individual conversations. So Steve talked about reducing the number of conversations. We don't need tens of thousands, we don't need thousands, we need hundreds of conversations. We also need to focus on the fact that heat is an incredibly important thing that needs to be decarbonised, which seems to have been lost in recent years. Certainly the government statistics tell us that heat decarbonisation is the most important thing in terms of where carbon emission sits, and we don't currently seem to be the poster child for decarbonising energy in the UK. That seems to have reverted very much back to solar and wind. And most importantly, we also need to create advocates and champions within local authorities to help us deliver heat networks through heat network zoning. We can't see the local authorities being a sort of a passive actor in heat network zones. We need to see them being a very involved, proactive organisation that is helping facilitate the development of heat networks and supporting heat network developers. So it remains for me to just say thanks very much for Steve to joining us in the UKDEA podcast studio today, and look forward to our next issue. Thanks very much indeed.